Thanks for joining us for today's message. You're about to watch a message from Pastor Brenen Beeler in our series titled Gods and Kings, where Matthew presents Jesus as the one true God and King, in a time where kings wanted to be worshipped as gods. We're always encouraged to hear how God is using this ministry to touch lives. If you have a story to share about how God has been working in your life, would you please let us know and email us at yourstory@regeneratechurch.com. Also, if you would like to help support this ministry financially, you can do so by going online and clicking the Giving tab at regeneratechurch.com and help us bring messages like this one every week to people all around the world. Now let's prepare our hearts to hear from God's Word.
Have you ever found yourself in some hot water, facing a difficult situation? And because you were in that difficult situation, it brought about a difficult decision. Because you're going through something that's difficult, it's causing the decisions to make about your future or what you're going to do, whether it's going to college or getting a job or job shifting or having another child or whatever hard decisions you found yourself in because of being in a difficult situation. Well, that's what we see in our text today for a man named Pilate. Pilate was the governor of Judea, the southern region of Israel, Jerusalem. He was over that region, and he had to make sure his main responsibility that was given to him was to keep peace in Jerusalem. A difficult task, no doubt. If you know anything that's going on in the world today, there really has rarely ever been peace in the Middle East. And his job was to make sure he kept peace in Jerusalem. And so he found himself over that province to rule there, but he found himself in hot water. For when he was first commissioned with that territory, he came into Jerusalem flexing the power of Rome, marching in with that garrison, carrying their poles with the eagle emblem of that bird of Roman's power. And so he marched in and he went into the temple area. But because of that, the Jewish people looked at that emblem as an idol. Images of animals and birds were thought to be idols to the Jewish people in that day. And so there was a riot that broke out, an uprising against that Roman garrison, and Pilate himself trying to flex his muscles and show the power of Rome. And so this riot breaks out. So he grabs all the rioters and marches them into this amphitheater and says because of their lack of respect to the authority that was over them, that they're all going to have their heads chopped off. They didn't back down. They didn't cower in fear. They said, go ahead, chop our heads off. But if you do, you're going to have 10,000 more rioting and standing up for this. And so Pilate realized he got himself into some hot water. And so he backed down. But when the emperor heard of what took place and how he tried to flex the power of Rome and then he ended up backing down off of that power of Rome, the emperor in Rome wasn't too happy that some rioters were able to dethrone Pilate in some ways. And so he was put in probationary period of time where if he makes one more mistake, he does one more thing wrong, he's out of there. He's lost his authority and he'll be brought back to Rome and demoted. And so now Pilate has found himself in a difficult situation. He has to keep peace. He has to keep rule because Rome didn't have enough troops to put everywhere in their known territories in all of the lands that they've conquered. So they had to have a small amount of troops that weren't enough if there was an uprising to keep peace. So Pilate's job was to keep peace. And so Pilate, now in some hot water and on some thin ice, about to lose his position, now Jesus comes on the scene. And Jesus threatens the power of the religious leaders, and there's complete unrest. But Pilate, seemingly up until this point of the story, has stayed out of it. He's allowed the religious people to kind of deal with their own religious problems. And he's kept himself out of it, trying to stay out of the problem and out of the unrest that was going on throughout Jerusalem and the riots that often would almost break out when Jesus would say something on the temple stairs where he claimed to be God and they wanted to kill him, and then he kind of vanished into the crowd supernaturally. And all these things, Pilate has stayed out of it. But now, no longer he gets that opportunity. For you see, Jesus, we saw, was arrested, betrayed by Judas in the garden, had an illegal trial in the home of Caiaphas at night throughout the evening. They did several things that was against their own law and moral standing as their religious law. They broke many of their own rules in order to put Jesus to death because they didn't care if he was innocent or not. They knew the truth. They just wanted their power. And Jesus was a threat to their religious power. And so they wanted Jesus dead no matter what. They got people to testify against him. They didn't allow a defense. There was a completely illegal trial. And now they found Jesus guilty. And so now they drag Jesus to Pilate. And that's where we pick up in our story in verse 11 of Matthew chapter 27. Now Jesus was standing before Pilate, the Roman governor. And Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "You've said it." But when the leading priests and the elders made their accusations against him, Jesus remained silent. "Don't you hear all of these charges they're bringing against you?" Pilate demanded. But Jesus made no response to any of the charges, much to the governor's surprise. You see, Jesus remained silent when they were bringing all sorts of outlandish accusations against him. The reason why? God said it would be that way. Isaiah chapter 53 was prophesied 750 years prior to this. Isaiah said that when the Messiah will come, he will be as a lamb brought before the slaughter, and he will not open his mouth. Jesus didn't try to defend himself. Jesus knew what he had to do, and so he didn't try to give a defense, but he remained silent, allowing the process to take place. You see, the problem with defending yourself is that once you start defending yourself or trying to defend yourself, you'll never be able to stop trying to defend yourself. And let me put it to you this way: the Lord will always be a better defense for you than you can be for yourself. It would be like if you go to court and you decide that you want to represent yourself as your own legal defense. And so you give all the reasons why you're not guilty and all of that. Or you could have Larry H. Parker. Larry H. Parker got me $4.5 billion. And you could have him be your defense. Which would you choose? An experienced person that knows how to defend, or yourself? You would be foolish not to take the free legal defense. The point's proven. You can try to be your defense when people bring all sorts of outlandish accusations against you or talk bad about you or backbite you, or you can just allow the Lord to be your defense. But you have to choose, because once you start defending yourself, you're telling the Lord, "I don't want you to defend me. I will take over from here." Or you can stop defending yourself and say, "Lord, I want you to take over from here." When people say all sorts of things about you, two things you need to realize. They did it to Jesus, so why would you expect it not to happen to you? Jesus said a servant isn't greater than his master. They hated me, they will hate you also. So when people say things about you or attack you, listen, don't be taken by surprise by it. And secondly, let the Lord be your defense, because the truth will always be made known. The truth will always come out. So allow the Lord to be your defense, because the truth will be made known. Pilate knew the truth, so he thought he would use this custom to get out of being in this hot water. Look at verse 15. Now it was the governor's custom each year during the Passover celebration to release one prisoner to the crowd. anyone they wanted. This year, there was a notorious prisoner, a man named Barabbas. As the crowds gathered before Pilate's house that morning, he asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" He knew very well that the religious leaders had arrested Jesus only out of envy. So Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent. He knew what was really going on. But he also had to keep peace between the religious leaders and the people and all the different dynamics that were taking place in Jerusalem. And so Pilate, trying to get himself out of the issue, allowed the people to choose which person they would want. And so he compared Jesus to Barabbas. You see, Barabbas was a serial killer. He was an insurrectionist, a murderer. He was one bad dude. And so he figured if he compared Jesus to Barabbas, the people wouldn't want Barabbas back. No, please, keep Barabbas in jail. We'll take Jesus, knowing that Jesus was innocent. Pilate knew Jesus didn't do anything wrong, so he figured the people would surely choose Jesus. But just then, verse 19, as Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him this message: "Leave the innocent man alone. I suffered through a terrible nightmare about him last night." So Pilate is in the middle of this difficult situation. He's found himself in some hot water. He's trying to get out of having to make a hard decision, but politically, it made more sense to do what the crowd wanted than what was right. His conscience told him that Jesus was innocent. Roman law said not to put an innocent man to death. His wife even had a nightmare about this that caused her to go to her husband and say, "Don't do anything, let him go." And so Pilate, well, he found himself caring more about the fear of his own position, the fear of the crowd, than doing what was right. Contrast that with Jesus' decision to go to the cross in verse 20. Meanwhile, the leading priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask Barabbas to be released and for Jesus to be put to death. So the governor asked again, "Which of these two do you want me to release to you?" And the crowd shouted back, "Barabbas!" Pilate responded, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." "Why?" Pilate demanded. "What crime has he committed?" But the mob roared even louder, "Crucify him." And Pilate saw that he wasn't getting anywhere and that a riot was developing. So he sent for a bowl of water and he washed his hands, which is a Jewish custom. To wash your hands of that, to mean that I am innocent. It was a legal matter that was found in the Old Testament, that if you had no control over it, you would wash your hands of it and that you would give that over. And so that's what Pilate was doing. He was saying that it's not me that's putting Jesus to death, it's you. Although that's what he would like to think, that's not really what reality is, because Pilate was still responsible for his decision and he didn't want to make that decision because of his fear of the crowd. But Jesus, on the other hand, Jesus is going through with going to the cross. And so Pilate, washing his hands before the crowd, saying, "I'm innocent of this man's blood. The responsibility is yours." And all the people yelled back, "We will take the responsibility for his death, we and our children." It's interesting. Pilate, afraid of the crowd and a mob, and so he's trying to appease the crowd. So he does what is wrong to appease the crowd. Jesus, on the other hand, had the crowd on Palm Sunday a few days before this, praising him, yelling, "Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest," recognizing him as Savior. But by Friday, this day, the same exact people and the same exact crowd are yelling no longer Hosanna, but "Crucify him," because the crowds are fickle. And when they didn't get what they wanted, they turned on Jesus. And the same crowd that was shouting Hosanna became the same crowd shouting "Crucify him." Now note this. If Jesus was doing what he was doing for the approval of man, and that was his motivating factor in his life and ministry, Jesus would have never made it to the cross. Pilate did the wrong thing because of the fear of man, because he had the crowd's approval. Jesus does the right thing because of the obedience to the Father, not caring about the approval of people. Aren't you happy that Jesus didn't come to save humanity on the basis whether people were going to applaud him and like what he was doing or not? Aren't you thankful when people were saying that they didn't want him, that Jesus said, fine, have it your way and leave? But that Jesus went through with what God had sent him to accomplish because he cared about being obedient to God. So let me ask you, what's your motivating factor in all that you do? Galatians chapter 1 verse 10 says, "For I am now seeking the approval of man or of God. Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ." Pilate was hesitant to sentence Jesus to death. But John chapter 19 verse 12 gives us more of an insight to what was going on in Pilate's life, because it says, because of the religious leaders, they threatened to report Pilate to Caesar. So Pilate became afraid. Rome didn't have enough soldiers, and so Pilate knew a recall would then ensue. And he was afraid of a recall because certain governors can be taken out by recalls. And so Pilate knew the power of a recall. And so he was trying to do the right thing and not get recalled. And so he was trying to appease the people instead of doing what was right. So verse 26, Pilate released Barabbas to them, and he ordered Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip, then turned him over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. This was a common practice for Roman officials to scourge a man before his death sentence. The reason why, because in that whipping, it would cause the guilty to confess their wrong, their sin, their crime. And in confessing their crime, they would self-sentence themselves to death. For you see, they would already be sentenced to death, so what do I have to lose if I go ahead and confess what I did that was wrong? All that would do is stop the whipping. And so they would mount someone to a pillar, a wood post coming up out of the ground. And they would chain that person to that, and then they would take the cat of nine tails, which was between 9 and 12 leather straps. At the end of those leather straps would be these weighted lead balls. And when you would be whipped with that, those weighted lead balls would welt you so bad that the swelling would take place on your back and on your side. And then there would be bits of glass and metal embedded into those leather straps. So after your skin would swell, those straps would be laid onto your back in such a way that they would lay it on, and then it would be the ripping off of those straps, of the welts, that would take your back and shred it to pieces. And so that excruciating pain, many people actually died from being whipped in this way. They would lose so much blood because of the back being torn apart. It would actually tear all of the flesh off the back, and it would actually expose many times your internal organs. And then the organs even being damaged through that whipping, which would cause someone to die. And so many of these criminals, when they would be going through this, after 3, 4, 5, 10, 12 lashes, they would begin to confess all of their crime, because if they would confess their crime, the whipping would stop. But Jesus had no crime to confess. He did nothing wrong. There was no sin, there was no crime. And so Jesus remained silent, and he took all 39 lashes being torn apart. If you've ever seen The Passion of the Christ, the only problem I have with The Passion of the Christ is that it wasn't brutal enough. But they couldn't make it any more brutal. But the Bible declares that Jesus was beaten and whipped and marred more than any other man ever. He was so disfigured in the beating and the whippings that people couldn't even recognize him as a man, as a human. He was so affected and so beaten in his face, his swollen, you couldn't even recognize who he was. But Jesus had no sin to confess, nothing wrong that he ever did. And so he took the whippings, one after another after another. But you might say, why did Jesus have to go through the whippings? Wasn't it enough that Jesus went to the cross? Why did he have to be whipped in addition to going to the cross? You see, our sin was paid for on the cross. But Isaiah 53 verse 5 says that he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so that we could be made whole, and he was whipped so that we could be healed. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24, Peter, after Christ's crucifixion, looking back at the cross, says that same thing, that he personally carried our sins in his body on the cross so that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. And by his wounds or stripes, you are healed. Peter, recognizing that it was through the striping, through the whipping, that healing was released. Isaiah prophesied that it would be through the whipping that healing would be released. You see, the whipping released healing in a way that the cross wouldn't. So to all people, physical, spiritual, mental healing for body, soul, and spirit, healing is promised to all people. And you might say, well, wait a minute, Brenen. I prayed for healing for a friend, a family member. They died. Or perhaps you would say, Brenen, I'm praying for healing right now, but my symptoms seemingly are getting worse, and I've been praying for healing, but I am not experiencing healing. What do you mean healing is promised to all people? When Christ was whipped and his body was split open, healing was released for all people. The only question is the timing of that healing. Whether it's now, sometime in the near future, or ultimately in eternity. But because of Jesus' whipping, because of his stripes, we are healed. Not might be, not hope we are, but we are. Every single person who receives what Christ has done for them, healing is promised. Now, it might be physical healing, but it might be eternal healing. But healing is for all people. And it goes on to say in verse 27, some of the governor's soldiers took Jesus into their headquarters, and they called the entire regiment, which a regiment is about 200 men. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and they wove a thorn branches into a crown and put it on his head. And then they placed a reed stick in his right hand as a scepter. And then they knelt before him in mockery and taunted, "Hail, King of the Jews." And they spit on him and grabbed the stick out of his hand and struck him on the head with it. And when they were finally tired of mocking him, they took off the robe, off of his hamburger meat back, ripped it off like a bandage off of a fresh wound, and ripped that off of him and placed his own clothes on him again. And they led him away to be crucified. Along the way, they came across a man named Simon, who was from Cyrene, and the soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. Now Simon, who was a Cyrene is an ancient territory for what is now known as Libya in the northern part of Africa. Simon would have traveled to Jerusalem during this time for the Passover sacrifice, to sacrifice a lamb for his own sin and the sin of his entire family. Many people who couldn't afford the travel would travel one time in their lifetime to make propitiation for their sins, to have the covering for their sins, as the cost of sin was death. They understood that, but it didn't have to be their own death. It was through the propitiation of another's blood, the lamb, the sacrificial lamb that would be a covering for their sin, not a cleansing, but a covering for their sin. So Simon travels, and as he's there in Jerusalem, during this Passover season, he sees crowds gathering on the street, all sorts of commotion. And so he goes to check out what's going on. What's all this commotion about? And so he takes a closer look. He makes his way through the crowd. And perhaps right when he makes his way through the crowd, he sees this man collapse. For you see, Jesus had to carry his own cross. But because of the blood that he had already lost and in his weakened condition, he collapsed under the weight of the cross. Most likely he would be carrying the cross beam to the cross that he would have to carry on his shoulders. That usually weighing between 125 and 175 pounds. He would have to lug that up the mountain to where he would be crucified. But in his weakened state, collapses, and so it was a Roman soldier's right to select someone. He would place his spear tip on his shoulder, and he would be commanded then to help the Roman officer, and what he would be commanded to do. It was the Roman soldier's right to do that. And so he picks this man out of the crowd. He selects this man and says, you pick up the cross and carry it. No doubt in that moment, Simon was thinking, oh no, why didn't I just mind my own business? Why did I have to see what was going on? Why didn't I just stay out of it? Why am I even here? What am I getting myself into? Simon was probably thinking, I came to meet with God and see a sacrifice take place that my sins would be covered. And now he's being pulled out of that for a divine appointment. Simon thought he had an appointment to meet with God, and God had an appointment to meet with Simon. And he was selected, and he was carrying that cross along with Jesus, arm in arm, as they would carry that cross together. It's interesting, though, as Simon went through this process, we don't really hear much about him until later in Mark chapter 15. It refers to Simon as the father of Rufus and Alexander. You might think, well, what does that mean other than he came up with bad names for his children? Rufus, it sounds like a dog's name. Just kidding. If your name's Rufus, we love you. We're so glad that you're part of our online campus. Rufus and Alexander, Romans chapter 16 says that Alexander was a close friend to Paul, which shows that Simon, at some point along this journey in watching Christ be crucified, he became a convert. At first, we think when we're going through a difficult situation or we have a problem or things aren't working out like we think they should work out, we think, why this? Why am I going through this? Why do I have to bear this cross? But Jesus would say, you're bearing this cross so that you can become closer to me. Simon had to bear that cross so that he could come into knowledge of who Jesus was. As he was involved in cross bearing, somewhere along the line, he became a convert, and his kids became the leaders in the early church because of what took place in Simon's life that day. You see, when things aren't working out like you expected things to work out, God is using those things to bring you closer to him. And so Jesus had an appointment to meet with Simon. At that moment, Simon came to meet with God, but God met with Simon that day, and Simon's life would never be the same. Church, when you go through something, you might think, why do I have to bear this cross? Why am I going through this suffering? Why did I get into this? I should have just stayed out of it. Now I'm all involved in the situation I wish I wouldn't have been involved in. This wasn't working out like Simon thought things would be working out, no doubt. And when things aren't working out like you think they should be working out, know that God has a plan in all of it. Maybe a divine appointment to bring you into a closer relationship with him. Then it says in verse 33, and they went out to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And the soldiers gave him wine mixed with bitter gall, but when he had tasted it, he refused to drink it. Jesus was offered gall, which is a type of myrrh. A property within it has a property that numbs pain, and so they gave him something to help take the edge off offered Jesus a couple of Advil, liquid Advil, fast acting. But Jesus refused to take anything that would numb the pain because he knew he had to go through that process and experiencing that pain so that we wouldn't have to. It says in verse 35, after they had nailed him to the cross, the soldiers gambled for his clothes by throwing dice, which was a fulfillment to Psalms 22, verse 18. Hundreds and hundreds of years before crucifixion was ever even invented, it described exactly what would take place with the Messiah, when the Messiah would come and how he would die for the sins of the world and what would be taking place around that. The psalmist had a vision of it with the soldiers gambling. That's exactly what was taking place. They were gambling, casting lots for his robe. 5 articles that Jesus would have. 4 soldiers there at the cross. The 5th was a robe without seam, a valuable robe, something of great value and something that they didn't want to tear apart, just take apart at the seams because it was one piece, the way it was formed and knitted together, the way that it was sewn, it didn't have any seam attached to it. It was just one piece. And because of that value, they didn't want to tear it apart and split it into 4s. And so they gambled over it, who would get the robe, who would be the lucky winner. Then it says in verse 36, they sat around and kept guard as he hung there. And a sign was fastened to the cross above Jesus' head, announcing the charge against him. It read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." It's interesting, that sign, I don't have much time to talk about it, but it's the Tetragrammaton. And literally, if you look at the acronyms of the first letters of each of those words written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, it would spell Yahweh. The literal letters to describe Jehovah, Yahweh, will be the letters written on that sign. A really interesting thing, if you're interested in that, you can look into it further. That sign was above Jesus' head. That's why when the religious leaders saw that sign, they had a big hissy fit over it and demanded that that sign come down because over Jesus' head it literally was Yahweh. And so they didn't want that there, obviously, understanding that the meaning of that name was so holy to write, they wouldn't even write the word with the vowels in it. And so Jesus had that over his head, that sign, as he hung there. And then 2 revolutionaries, verse 38, were crucified with him, one on his right and the other on his left. And the people passing by shouted abuse, shaking their heads in mockery. "Look at you now," they yelled at him. "You said you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Well then, if you are the Son of God, save yourself and come down from the cross." The leading priests, the teachers of religious law, and the elders also mocked Jesus. "He saved others," they scoffed, "but he can't save himself. So he is the King of Israel, is he? Let him come down from the cross right now, and we will believe in him. He trusted God, so let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" Even the revolutionaries who were crucified with him ridiculed him in the same way. Notice that. The man on Jesus' left and the man on his right, both of them were also joining in and mocking Jesus. Wait a minute, I thought one was mocking Jesus, but I thought one gave his life to Jesus. He did later. But they were both, according to Matthew's gospel, mocking Jesus. Even the thief that would give his life to Christ and say, "When you come into your kingdom, remember me," and Jesus told him, "Today you will be with me in paradise," earlier on the cross was joining in the mockery against Jesus. But as that man hung there, watching Jesus suffer and die and how he endured the suffering, he realized something was different about this man because of how Jesus went through his suffering. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 says that the way that we go through our sufferings gives us a ministry to witness to other people. When other people see how you go through your suffering and how it doesn't affect you in the same way that it normally would, they have an opportunity to see Jesus in your life. I think of Paul in Acts chapter 18 when he found himself shipwrecked on the island of Mileta. and a snake, a venomous snake, a viper fastened onto his hand and bit him. All the other native people to that island, they knew the serpent, the power of the serpent strike. They knew what would take place. They knew in just a moment Paul would swell up like an Oompa Loompa, turn blue, and die. And so they were watching and waiting for it to take place. But it says that when they noticed that the serpent's strike didn't affect him, then they stopped mocking him and received him and his message that he had to share with them. Do you realize that when the serpent, Satan, strikes you and attacks you, but you have the peace that surpasses all understanding, you have the joy of the Lord that would be your strength, when people watch how it affects you and they realize that it's not affecting you in the way that it should be affecting you, it gives you an opportunity to be able to share Jesus with them clearly. And people can see Jesus clearly in the way that you go through your suffering. That's what took place in this man's life. He saw Jesus suffer, and he saw who he really was. And so this man ended up giving his life to the Lord. And it's interesting that Jesus even received him. While Jesus was suffering the worst type of pain you could ever endure, Jesus still received this man. Although he was mocking him just a few moments earlier, Jesus received him and welcomed him in to the family. And so this man, mocking him, ridiculed him in the same way. And then at noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Some of the bystanders misunderstood and thought he was calling for Elijah because he said, "Eli, Eli," and they thought he was saying the words Elijah. One of them ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, holding it up to him on a reed stick so he could drink. But the rest said, "Wait, let's see whether Elijah comes to save him." Then Jesus shouted out again as he released his spirit. And at that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split apart, and tombs opened. And the bodies of many godly men and women who had died were raised from the dead. They left the cemetery after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city of Jerusalem and appeared to many people. The Roman officer and the other soldiers at the crucifixion were terrified by the earthquake and all that had happened. Could you imagine a bunch of people that have been dead for years? When Jesus died, literally the healing and the power of God was released throughout the land, and the power of Jesus flowed out, breaking rocks, and tombstones were broken open, and graves then were opened, and the power of God, the resurrecting power, was released, and people came back to life. And then we're walking, man, imagine that trip. Grandpa, what are you doing here? You died like 20 years ago. And now the Roman officer and the Roman soldiers, they're freaked out. Rightfully so. I'd be freaked out too. At noon, everything is dark when the sun should be at its brightest. It's pitch black. The earth is shaking. I mean, this is a major earthquakes. Things are shaking. Things are happening. They're freaked out of their minds. And then they said, this man truly was the Son of God. Not only do others that are suffering next to you have an opportunity to see Christ in the way that you handle your suffering, but oftentimes the one that are inflicting the suffering in your life, when it doesn't affect you the same way that it should, and how you respond to that and how you deal with that, also gives the people who are inflicting the suffering in your life an opportunity to recognize who Jesus is. They recognize Jesus truly as the Son of God. And many women who had come from Galilee with Jesus to care for him were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of James and John, the sons of Zebedee. These women came to be there with Jesus. These women who ministered to Jesus and the disciples practically, they were the ones that were there when the disciples had run. Now, one of the things that I know to be true for most of us, if not all of us, is that there are certain things that we can take for granted in our life, like the cross of Christ. understanding what Jesus went through for each of us. But when you realize that Jesus suffered for you and for me, and he was willing to do all of that for us individually, if we were the last person on earth, he still would have done that. You realize the love that Christ has for us. He was willing to die, this horrendous death, this brutal death, in order so that we could live. He loves you that much. May we never forget the love of Christ. Pilate made decisions out of fear. Christ made decisions out of faith that God would resurrect him. The crowds tried to say, crucify him. But Jesus went along with it because he knew it was all part of the plan. Because Christ had to die in order for there to be life. Without the grave, there was no resurrection. Without his wounds, there would be no healing. Without the cross, there is no hope. And without Jesus' death, there would be no life. So he did it for us. He did it for you. He did it for me. So at the cross, we can hand over our sins and have exchange for righteousness. At the cross, we can lay down our burdens and return and receive freedom. At the cross, we can come broken, yet leaving restored. So why would Jesus do that for me? Because he loves you enough to die for you. But the story doesn't end there. There is more to the story, and it's to be continued, because Christ doesn't stay in the grave. He's buried, but death could not hold him. Death could not defeat him. Christ came out victorious, claiming victory over your sin and death. And you're just going to have to wait 2 weeks to get the rest of the story. Let's pray.
Thanks again for joining us for today's powerful message in our series titled Gods and Kings. If you'd like to help support this ministry financially, you can do so by going online and clicking the Giving tab at regeneratechurch.com, and help us continue to bring messages like this one every week to people all around the world. We'll see you later, guys. God bless.